Hello and welcome to the Interchange Book 3, Unit 14 video. Today we're going to be talking about the passive voice to describe a process. Okay. So first, to understand the passive voice, we're going to review that for one moment. We need to look at the active voice. So let's look at a process. For example, how do you create a building? Well, maybe the first step in the process of making a building is that the architect designs the building. That's probably the first step, right? Now, this sentence is in the active voice. And the active voice basically takes a doer, in this case, the architect, because the architect in the sentence is doing something, so we call it the doer. So the doer then does the action. And so the architect designs, and design is my verb, and the architect designs the building, and the building is my receiver, because it's receiving the action of the verb. So the active voice is the doer does something to the receiver. In this context, the architect designs the building. Okay? Now, when I talk about the passive voice, okay, I'm going to sort of reorder the sentence a little bit, right? Now, the passive voice basically takes the receiver and it wants to use that for the subject of the sentence. It's the first thing that I talk about. And then the doer is the second thing that I talk about, okay? It's not as important as the receiver, okay? Now, the other thing that you have to think about is that the passive voice is always using some type of form of be plus a past participle. So we change the verb into a past participle and we use be. So if I think about this sentence in the active voice, the architect designs the building, how could I say that using the passive voice? Well, it would look like this. The building is designed by the architect. Again, so I'm using the receiver first, the building, then my verb to be is, then the past participle, designed, and then I use my preposition by to indicate who does this action. So by the architect, by the doer, okay? Now, in this context, right, I'm using my passive voice to talk about the building first. I don't necessarily need to talk about who does the action. And that's the idea of the passive voice. But let's think why. Why do we use the passive voice? Well, probably the biggest reason why we use the passive voice is that it's not important what is doing the action. So it's used for describing a process in the context that, well, I don't need to talk about who is doing this action. Who is building the building is not important. I just want to talk about the building. So if I say this in the passive voice, the building is designed. Now, I don't necessarily need to talk about who is doing it, okay? Because that's not the important part of my sentence. The important part is the process. The building is designed. That's the first step. Another reason why we use the passive voice is maybe it's obvious what is doing the action. So again, I don't need to talk about who is doing it if it's obvious. For obvious reasons, the architect builds the building. He designs the building. I don't need to tell you that. So again, in the passive voice, the building is designed. I don't need to talk about who is doing it. Now, the last reason why we do this is maybe that it's unknown what is doing the action. So in cases where I'm not sure who is doing the action, I don't want to talk about that first. I want to talk about the receiver first. Okay? So that's a little review on the passive voice. Now, let's talk about the topic today, using the passive voice for describing a process. Okay? Now, I want to ask you, how do you make gallo pinto? What are the steps? There are many steps to making gallo pinto, but what about the first step, or the second step, or the third step? What do you do? Or what needs to be done? So, maybe many of you are thinking that the first thing you need to do is this. You cook the beans. You cook the beans. Now, this is a sentence in the active voice, because if we notice, I'm saying you, and that's the doer, cook the beans, and the beans is the receiver. But often when I talk about a process, I don't need to talk about who is doing something. It's not important who is cooking the beans. It's important that the beans are cooked. So I'm using this in a passive voice to talk about the process. The beans are cooked. Again, using the receiver first, the beans, my verb to be, are, and the past participle cooked. The beans are cooked. That's the passive voice. But we want to show today how to give your passive voice sentence a little bit extra flavor. Something like an emphasis. So, basically, to emphasize the importance of an action in a process, you can use a modal. So, for example, it's very important that the beans are cooked. Okay? It's absolutely necessary. No one wants to eat gallo pinto if the beans are not cooked, right? So I'm going to say, well, the beans must be cooked. And I'm using a modal verb, in this context must, to emphasize how important that the beans are cooked. And I use the sentence, the beans must be cooked. It's really, really important. Okay? Now, something to think about, that when I use a modal verb, for example, must, I am always going to use be in the passive voice after must. Because when I use a modal verb, I use the base form of the verb. And so the base form of the verb to be is be. So I'm always using be in my passive voice. Okay, so let's look at some different modals that we use in the passive voice. So we can always use different types of modals to give more of an emphasis to our sentence. So I could say, for example, the beans must be cooked, and that sounds very mandatory when I use the modal verb must, okay? It sounds like it's mandatory. If I say the beans need to be cooked, right? That sounds like it's very necessary. If I say the beans have to be cooked, again, that sounds like it's very necessary to do it. I could also say the beans have got to be cooked, okay? And there's no difference between these two, have to and have got to. They're basically the same thing. And I can say the beans should be cooked, and that's more of a good idea, right? Or I could say the beans may be cooked, and again, that's sort of a good idea. Or I could even say the beans can be cooked, and that's more of a possibility. But the idea is that I'm using these modals, like must, need to be, or needs to be, if my receiver is singular, or have to, or have got to, or should, or may, right? Plus the passive voice, which is be plus the past participle. And I'm using this to give the sentence a little bit more emphasis, right? And again, like we said, when you use the modal verb, you're always going to use the verb to be, because I use the base form after my modal verbs. So let's look at our steps. So step number 1, if we remember, I'm saying that the beans need to be cooked. That's the passive voice. Step number 2, the rice has to, again, be made using the passive voice. Step number 3, the onion and the pepper have got to be cut and cooked. Step number 4, the beans and rice must be mixed with the vegetables. And the last step, of course, right? Maybe the most important step. is that the Lozano sauce should be added. Okay? So these are the steps for making gallo pinto using the passive voice. And we use the passive voice in a process usually because the person doing it is not important. It's important that the receiver is talked about first. The action is talked about first. So I hope this was helpful in understanding how we use the passive voice to talk about a process, but also how we use the modal verb in the passive voice to give the sentence more emphasis. So, good luck.